Hey everybody, welcome to the live challenge. I'm excited to stop by today and talk about threads. And believe me, I have a lot to talk about on the subject. I've been chatting with everybody before I went live, getting some good questions. So I've got plenty of questions to talk about, plenty of thread examples to show you, and I think it's going to be a really fun time. I'll give you a little bit of warning. First up, it's probably going to be a longer chat than normal, so hopefully you've got everything you need and you're snuggled in and ready to talk about threads. So first, what I want to do is kind of show you what the format of this is going to look like. Over on one side, I have a handout that I'll be kind of working through, and this is what I use in my thread, needles, and tension class. You can access this in the description box. There's a link in there, and you can download this handout so that you don't have to try to remember all the stuff that I'm saying. And then also over here, I'll be showing some threads closer up. Now I know it's kind of difficult in this format to really see the threads, but hopefully the information that I give you will be helpful and you'll be successful with it. So first, let's talk about quilting with thread and piecing thread and what the deal is with thread. And it was great because somebody commented in the section, it was like, it's something we don't talk about a lot, and it's really not because it's so subjective. Thread is something that ultimately it depends on what you like. So all I'm going to do in this chat is kind of talk through what I like to use and why I like to use it. But I will say that, you might find something different. So don't take what I'm saying and feel like you have to do exactly what I'm saying. This will hopefully just give you a starting off point for picking your threads. Now we'll talk about thread materials, we'll talk about thread weights, we'll talk about thread colors, and I'll show you some quilted examples, and we'll have a great time. And then I'm going to announce the winner from last week's chat, a quilt kit for the variable star quilt. So exciting. I've got the name of the winner for that, and I'll tell you what next week's weekly giveaway is. Although we won't be having a chat next week, because that's Thanksgiving here in the US, so we'll be doing our live chat in 2 weeks, December 3rd. But let's talk about our threads and the different kind of weights of thread or types of threads that we're working with. So when you're thinking of threads, there's a couple different things you have to take into account. You can't just pick the color, you need to think of material and weight. So first, let's kind of tackle what the different threads are made out of and what their benefit is for. So first up is cotton. So cotton thread, I love cotton. I love Aurifil, it's my favorite. Cotton thread is made by, weaving together cotton staples or cotton fibers. So the more twisting together the cotton fibers, that's how it's made, the more high quality it is, the longer those fibers are, and the more it can handle machine quilting. Now, cotton thread is great because it has a little bit more of a grab to it. So it's perfect for piecing. It gives you a nice tight seam. I like to use it for piecing. Or if I want to piece and quilt on my sewing machine and don't want to have to change up different kinds of tension and stuff. This is a great place to start if you're like, I just want to use one kind of thread and I don't want to have to try to adjust and move in between things. So there are pros and cons to every kind of thread. In the handout, it kind of will show you the different ones. So some of the pros are, that it's a natural fiber. Some people really like that, especially if you're working with cotton fabric, which I'm assuming you are. So it also has a little bit of a sheen, not a whole lot, but just that threadiness from that twist just gives it a little bit of a different look. So it tends to show up more than poly thread of the same weight. So if I want the quilting to show up a little bit more, or I want that cotton thread, or back in the day when I would quilt for customers, if they wanted that purest, that cotton thread. Now there are some downsides to it since it's made from twisting those pieces together. I'm sorry, I'm looking to make sure everybody can hear me okay. Looks like some people are having trouble. Let me move this closer. Okay. All right, well, I hope everybody can see this. I'm going to not look at the chat because I get distracted, but I moved the microphone up, so hopefully you can hear a little bit better. So one of the downsides, though, to cotton thread is the lint factor. So since it's made from those different twists, it tends to be more linty than polyester, and it's really hard to tell if a cotton thread is good quality or not just by looking at it. So you're going to want to go with a reputable brand, something that that is good quality, and you can usually tell by price, right? If you think about when you go buy sheets, cotton sheets, if you're buying the sheets for $15 for your bed, they're probably not the best quality cotton. So if that kind of gives you a good idea, price isn't always an indication of quality, but when it comes to thread, it can really help guide that. So I like to use, or if I already said that, I love 50 weight cotton. So we'll talk about weights here in a second. I like 50 weight because it's a little bit thinner. It'll blend into the quilt top, but it's also strong enough to withstand machine quilting. And we're going to see other kinds of types of specialty threads, and so we'll talk about that. But here I want something that's nice and strong that can handle the machine quilting of going in all different directions. So cotton is going to be your bet for that. Okay, the next one we're going to talk about is core-spun poly, or it's called spun polyester. And we're going into a different type of material. So we're going into polyester, which is a synthetic material. It can be cheaper, but there's a lot of different kinds of polyester thread. So the first one is the core-spun poly. And what this is it's a polyester core, and then it has more polyester wrapped around it. This is going to be like your Omni thread by Superior. This is usually what serger thread is, or Max Lock or something like that. And down here, I guess I can scroll down so you can see. You can kind of see that's kind of what the cone looks like. Now, it is polyester, but it looks like cotton. So if you want the look of cotton without the expense and without the lint, this is going to be the best option. So like I said, Omni is my favorite. I don't recommend using serger thread for machine quilting, although I do tell my long arm owners, if it works, right? If it doesn't, then don't. But definitely using a higher quality thread will give you a better experience. It's strong, low lint, which is really nice. Still has a little bit more lint than your regular polyester, but it's less than cotton. So that would be the only drawback to it. If you are a price conscious customer, or you need just the best thread you can get at the cheapest price, Omni is usually a good bet, or this kind of thread, because it's polyester, so it's cheaper, and you can usually get a lot more of it. So this is something back in the day when I did quilt for customers, I would use in the bobbin thread. I liked that it had that grip to it, that, like the cotton would, but it didn't have as much lint as the cotton, so I didn't have to worry about cleaning out my bobbin case as much. And then I can use whatever thread I wanted to on the top, usually so fine. And we'll see that here in a second, and we'll talk about different threads and tops and bottoms, but in general, this is kind of what I used the core-spun poly for in the bobbin. So that is one type of polyester. So let's look at some other ones. The next one we'll talk about is filament polyester. So this is a little bit different. It's not twisted or wrapped like our core-spun poly. This is usually one long, piece, and then they're kind of twisted together depending on the sheen that we get. So the biggest benefit to this is it's a very strong thread. It's very strong. It has, in the handout, excellent elongation. Now, most of this information comes straight from Superior Threads website. They have such great resources on threads and needles, so I encourage you to check that out. So that wasn't my word, but I love it. Excellent elongation. That means it can stretch a bit before it snaps. So why does that help us as machine quilters? Well, if we're going in a bunch of different directions, we're putting stress on that thread. It can usually handle it a little bit more than cheaper threads, or even, maybe some cheaper cotton. So nice stretch to it. But it's the way that it's made that will give it its different effects. So let's look at, this is So Fine thread. So this is a 50 weight poly. This is what I use a lot. But what I love about it, it's polyester, it's thin, it's high quality. It can handle the machine quilting, and I don't get any lint. But I get strength out of it. So it's kind of a neat mixture of both, right? It's strong enough to handle it, but thin enough to blend in. And I have some examples I'll show you at the end of this different as it's quilted. So if I want the quilting to really blend in, if I'm using a thread over a bunch of different colors of fabric, So Fine is usually the one I'll go with. Again, it's going to blend in and look nice. This is available on spools and cones, so you can use it on your sewing machine. And you can also get a cone holder if you want to quilt on your sewing machine. But sometimes you want the quilting to show up just a little bit more, right? Maybe, you want to show off the quilting, or you want just a little bit of a sheen. So lately, I've been last few years, I've been obsessed with glide thread. Now, glide thread, as you can tell, already has more of a sheen than the So Fine. That comes from the twist of the fiber. So it just has a little bit more twist to it, I think. Something about that, I'm not sure exactly what makes it different, but it's still strong. It's not like metallic thread, which we'll see here in a little bit. It's not like those finicky threads that you might come up against. And it's going to show up a little bit more. So this is a 40 weight thread. Now with weights, the lower the number, the thicker the thread. So this is definitely going to show up on my quilt a little bit more. So maybe this is when I'm recording videos or I'm quilting a really busy fabric and I just want to be able to see the quilting a little bit. It's going to give me a little bit more, just a little bit of pizzazz. It's not crazy glitter, glow in the dark thread. It's just a little bit of shimmer. So this has been one of my go-tos as well. So it really depends. What effect do I want? Do I not want the quilting to show as much, or do I want to see just a little bit of that sheen? So that can definitely help there. So when it comes to polyester, we also have, I don't know if this is on the list, it's not, it's bottom line. So again, another type of polyester thread. Bottom line is a really thin thread. I think it's 60 weight, I think. So much thinner, still made of the same material, still, gonna have that strength, but not as much because it's thinner. People love to use this in the bobbins because it just kind of disappears, or as like a fill. It's same with like micro quilter or 100 weight thread. Now you can tell how much I use bottom line. I bought this, years and years and years ago and never have used it. I had trouble with the bottom line, so I just went to So Fine and never moved on. So that brings up the question, what do you do if you're working with threads that are giving you trouble? Well, find a thread and a weight that works for you, and I just kind of hung out in that area until I felt more comfortable with the machine quilting, and then you can kind of reach out and try some different stuff. Okay, so thinner threads will require tension adjustments. That's the biggest thing to remember when it comes to polyester thread. One, you want it to be high quality from a reputable brand, but it's going to require a little bit more adjustment because now we can get those really fine threads that's hard to do with cotton. Now I will say that silk is a natural fiber and it's a great thread. It's very strong, but it's definitely more expensive, so another thing there. But polyester in general is the one that I use mostly. So that's usually Glide or So Fine is kind of where I hang out. And in fact, when I have new owners or give machine quilting classes, I say just hang out in the 40 to 50 weight until you get comfortable. Now, is that like a set rule? Is that like something that, you have to follow? Definitely not. I'm just saying that's my opinion, and that's what I've found in the past. And kind of looking through the chats a little bit, Magnifico from Superior is like Glide. So same kind of idea, that sheen comes from the twist. So there's also monofilament thread. So that would be like your monopoly or your invisible thread. This is when you want the quilting to like disappear. You don't want to see it at all. And I don't have an example of that here, but it does require tension adjustment. It's very thin. So in the past, what I've used this for is when I'm quilting quilts that are applique and a lot of different colors. Now you can tell I didn't make it because if it's applique, I didn't piece it. But if I really don't want the quilting to take away from that beautiful hand applique effect. So that has been the most part. Sometimes, if I'm working on a quilt with lots of different colors that are extreme, like from black to white to everything, and I'm gonna do an all over, I might use the monopoly for that as well. For the most part though, if I'm working with a scrap quilt or a quilt with different colors, I'll just find a color that works, and we'll talk about that here in a second. If you're working with a cone of monopoly on your long arm, you're gonna want a thread net for this. So what a thread net does, it just kind of goes around the thread and kind of keeps it from falling down. When we get those thinner threads or those finer, more specialty threads, they tend to kind of, as they're unspooling, fall down to the bottom, which is fine until they get stuck under and then snap. So if you're working with this on a sewing machine or long arm and you're using your cone holder up this way, you're going to want to use a thread net for that. And any kind of thin thread will benefit from that. If I'm using the spool on my long arm, I still use my regular vertical post. I don't necessarily feel like I have to put a side horizontal spool on that. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then don't worry about it. But sometimes that could be helpful as well. So your monofilament thread. Now there's some different kinds. There's polyester, there's rayon, there's nylon. Polyester is the preferred. Superior Threads goes into detail about that. Rayon is not as heat resistant and other reasons, but I just go with either monopoly or Aurifil has one too, I think, which is really good. Okay, So now we kind of are starting to venture out. Sorry, I forgot to change it. Here's the monopoly screen. Bad Angela, bad Angela. But now we're kind of venturing into the fun threads, those specialty threads that, you know, everybody wants to play with. So these are threads that are more for adding that wow to your quilting, or really, you know, just putting a nice touch to it. These aren't threads I would use over the whole quilt, because you're going to find they can be a little bit more difficult, but they can really make some neat effects. So let's talk about metallic thread. So metallic thread has a shine. You can see that pretty sheen, but it's made slightly different. And even, I know you can't feel it because you're on the other side of the screen, but it has a rougher texture to it. It's made just a little bit different than like our Glide or the other ones. So it's going to give me a really cool metallic effect, but I'm going to have to slow down. It's the main thing here. One of the questions came earlier was like, why do some threads have to be so finicky? Well, it's just how they're made. Just kind of like that thread wants to be difficult. So this one, you definitely have to slow down and even maybe loosen the tension a bit. So we don't want to put too much stress on this thread because it's not quite as strong as the polyester, but it does make a really cool effect. And I'm going to show you a quilted sample of all these here in a second. So metallic thread, definitely not the first thread to start out with when you're machine quilting for the first time. So as you are learning how to machine quilt, again, I can't stress this enough, stay within less finicky threads, that 40 to 50, maybe even 60 weight, stay there. But then once you feel comfortable and you're ready to really experiment, you can really have some fun with threads. So metallic thread. Another one is mylar. So check this out. Oh my gosh, so pretty, right? I love the very holographic look of this, but this is made a little bit different. This is actually like a tape. If you kind of think about it, it's not round like most threads. It's more flat. So this is a very example right here where I want to have a horizontal spool holder so that it comes off this way. If I use a vertical spool holder and I pull it up, I'm going to get a twist and it's going to make it hard to quilt successfully. If you think about it, the best example would be like toilet paper. If I had toilet paper and I pulled it up, it's going to make that twist, and that gives it some trouble. So definitely more finicky. Definitely going to slow down, very slow, because this is not as strong. And but it really does make a great effect. I have all these threads because I love all these threads. I don't use these very much, and when I do, it's usually in a class setting to say, look, you can use it, but I like to quilt fast. So these threads are not going to be my favorite ones to work with, but you can create some really, really cool effects. So that's just the different types. And there's others, right? There's rayon and there's nylon, but I'm talking about machine quilting threads. These would kind of be the ones you'll hang out with. The only thing that's not in my handout is silk thread, which I mentioned is very strong. It's one of the strongest natural fibers, low lint, but it is expensive. So not in the handout as well are some other specialty threads. I love threads. I collect threads the way some people collect fabric. I mean, I just love to have them, even if I'm not going to use them. I guess it's just like the people that buy fat quarter bundles to decorate. But this one I have used before. It's glow in the dark thread. How fun is that? So Nightlight is a fun thread to use, especially if you're working on a children's quilt or a novelty quilt. I've also had the idea of quilting like little phrases that would show up in the dark. I thought that'd be kind of fun. But they make this in a couple different colors, pink and green and yellow. And this is something I haven't done a lot of. Actually, I haven't done any of it, but it's just too fun. So some threads are for bobbins only. So this is Ricky Tim's Razzle Dazzle. I have this in a few colors just because I love it. And I use it mostly for like, not that I do a lot of embroidery or slow stitching, but this would be a cool hand stitching thread. This is mostly for bobbin work. So some people will put these thicker threads in their bobbin and then turn their quilt upside down and quilt that way. So there's so much less tension or less stress on bobbin threads. So this is a great way to be able to use those kinds of threads. Again, I don't ever use it, but it just looks pretty and it makes me happy. So I have a couple different colors of those. I would love to see or hear if anybody else has had, success with those. Okay, so those are the different kinds of threads. So let's talk about weights real quick. So when we're thinking of the quilt, the thread we want to use, perfect. What kind? Great. We want cotton or poly. Then we have to think about weight. And so the weight of the thread just is how thick or thin it is. But here's the fun thing. This is sarcasm, people. There is not a standard weight classification across the board. So it's not like you can say, oh, a 50 weight Aurifil is the same as a 50 weight whatever. So it has to do with how many plies make it up. Like, so Aurifil, I think, has 3 different plies, 3 different twists that make it up. So that 50 weight is still going to be a little bit thicker than a 50 weight of polyester. So it's really hard to say this is what size needle you should use across the board. But the thing to remember is that the weight of your thread will determine how much the quilting will show up. Right? Even if I use a contrasting color, if it's a 100 weight micro quilter, it's really not going to show up very much. It's also going to determine what size needle you should use. Okay, so here's the important thing. No matter what kind of thread you use, no matter what kind of color, if there's any rule to machine quilting, it's using the right needle for your thread. So different size needles have different size eyes that allow the thread to move through, and different size grooves on the front that kind of guide it to that eye. So if I'm using a really thick thread in a needle that's not the right size, if it's too small, now it has friction on all sides of the eye of the needle. Not to mention the fabric and the batting and the bobbin thread. It's just going to be too much. And you'll usually tell this is a problem if you have shredding and if you have shredding at the needle. So sometimes, depending on what kind of machine, you might see shredding up higher, especially in a long arm. I'll tell my owners, where's the shredding happening, because that will usually show you where the friction is on that thread. So you have to use the right needle for the thread. So which needle do you use for which? Well, I'm not always good at remembering numbers off the top of my head, but I will say that needle companies usually will give you some kind of guide. On my sewing machine, I know I've said this a lot. If you've been in any of my chats, you probably already know this. I love Superior's Top Stitch titanium needles. Okay, so they are stronger because they're titanium coated, and they're, they just work great. But the size you get depends on the kind of thread you're working with. Now on a long arm, again, I use the Handy Quilter needles, but it depends on the size of thread. But if you look at some guides will say, ooh, this needle will do a 40, 50, 60 weight. And this other needle will do a 50, 60, 80 weight or whatever. Well, there's a little bit of overlap there. So if you're having shredding, check your needle, make sure that it's not dull, and make sure that it's the right size for the type of thread. And you can always play around with different ones there. So really the needle depends on the weight. You want to make sure you have a new needle, a sharp needle, and make sure that it fits the weight of your thread. But let's do this. Let me move all my threads out of the way, and I'm going to pull out my quilted sample, and we'll see how the weight of the thread really affects the way it turns out. Plus I've got some questions to answer and some other samples to show you, so it's going to be a good time. All right, so here is my little sample. I know you can't see it yet. I'm getting it. From my Needles in Tension class. So let's see if I can put it under here. Now I will say the camera is going to keep trying to focus on this blue, so hopefully it won't be too distracting. I'll try to not move it around too much. Okay, so what I've done on this quilt is I took a piece of fabric and I took a spool of all my threads and I quilted a line of something. Row, row, row. And then what you can do is you could write off to the side on that sample what thread it is. Right? That's going to help you see what it's going to look like on a quilt. It'll also help you see what kind of adjustments need to be made. So up here, this is very thick thread. This is like, I want to say it's like 30 weight, or it's like jean stitch. I don't even remember because I don't have it here, but it's very, very thick. It's also variegated. So let's talk about color. What color thread should you use on your quilt? Well, it depends. It really depends. But if I'm using a variegated thread, this is only my opinion, I am going to use a variegated thread that has no colors that are in the top. So what that means is, let's say I'm quilting a black quilt. I'm not going to use a variegated thread that's black, gray, and light gray, because that black will disappear and the light gray will show up in random places. This is just my opinion. I don't love how that looks. So I'm going to pick colors that are different. So even though this has blue, it doesn't disappear. You can still kind of see it. So in this instance, I'm using variegated thread to make a statement. I'm using it because it looks really cool with all the different colors. I'm not using it because it matches all the colors in the quilt top. But here's the problem with thicker thread, right? So it's always Doesn't matter what it looks like on the front, right? It's always what's on the back. So let's look at the back. Look at that hot mess. So what's the problem here? If I can see that top thread on the bottom, that means my top thread needs to be tighter and it needs to pull up a little bit more. Of course, this is just a sample, so I wasn't too worried about it, but it's this reason right here that I struggle with variegated threads. In general, I want my bobbin thread color to be close to my top thread color, and it will help kind of hide any of those pokies. Well, that's hard to do with variegated thread, even if you use variegated thread on the bottom. So this is just because it's thicker though. If I wanted to, I would go with a thinner thread with this. A second. All right, over here, this is actually silk thread. So we can see how fine it is, how thin it is, nice and strong, beautiful sheen, but again, it's just more expensive. And I feel like I can get the same benefit of polyester for cheaper. More money for fabric or other thread. Okay, so now let's look at my next 3 rows. So these are the swirl hooks quilted in a row, 3 different rows, 3 different types of thread. And I'm sorry, it keeps trying to focus, and I bet that is so annoying. Stop. Let's see if I can get it to stop. Okay, so what I have here are 3 rows, each quilted with black thread in 3 different weights. And it's going to show you the difference that you can get. So this row right here is 40 weight. This is glide, so that's that little bit of a sheen that we saw. Then we have the so fine, not too different, right? Pretty similar. One shows up just a little bit more if you're looking at it in person. And then here, this is my 80 weight. So look how much that blends in more. So even though it's black thread on blue fabric, that thinner weight is really going to just kind of disappear a little bit more. So if you have threads and you're like, I don't know, I don't have the right color, if you have a thinner thread, it's going to blend in a little bit more. All right, the next one, so these are my specialty threads. So these are both metallic threads, so just different brands. I think one is Superior and I think one is Hab and Dash. It's Glide's company. Oh, I'm blanking on Glisten. Whew, I was like, I gotta remember. So again, really pretty. I mean, look how like sparkly that is. It's very cute. This is where you want the quilting to be a statement, right? We're not going to use a thread color that blends in if we're using metallic thread because that defeats the purpose. We're just going to really have some fun colors. Yep. Oh, actually, I take it back. This is the holographic thread. I was like, well, where's my holographic thread? This one is the one that's thinner that has to like, you know, go really slow. And then this is the metallic. So sorry, I misspoke on that. Sorry, I'm getting mesmerized by how shiny it is. So pretty. Okay, now let's move on to monopoly. So here is that monofilament thread, the thread that blends in. But here's the thing, you're still going to see the quilting a little bit because it's creating a texture change, right? It's the shadow that we're seeing, not so much the stitches. But again, it just blends in and disappears. There are different colors. There's like a light and a dark of the monopoly. So you could get a darker one if you're working on darker fabrics, but that stuff comes in so much of it on a spool that I just got a clear one, and that I've still been working on that one forever, so it's fine. All right, so then we're moving on to our different threads. So here we have, you know, some of our glide threads, and then moving on up to other ones. So you can just kind of see how the different colors and the different effects that you get from it. And this is a really good idea, trying out different threads before you get to a quilt. I always think the worst place to try a new thread is on a very important quilt or a quilt that's due tomorrow. Playing around on a sample piece will help you get comfortable with how you need to quilt with it. Now I know some people would say, but you don't have the seams, how can I? Well, no, but you're going to learn speed and tension and all that kind of stuff. So again, just a little sample of different designs. All right, so let's talk about some questions that came up, and I'm going to show you some other quilted examples. Because there were so many great questions before we started, and I can see them kind of coming through now, so I'm going to have to come back and try to address those later. But one question was, what kind of thread do you use on a scrap quilt or a quilt of a lot of colors when you have like all these different things? So in this example, if I'm doing an all-over design, it's going to be impossible to change threads between, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to find a neutral thread color in the value of most of the quilt. So this quilt has a little bit of light, but it's mostly medium, not a lot of dark to it. So I went with a taupey kind of so fine. So it's so fine 403, in case you're wondering. It's a really great color that blends in over a range. So even though it's a little bit darker here, it's definitely going to blend in over the rest. But when you're picking threads, my routine, or what I do, is I will lay out 3 or 4 threads on the quilt and see which one looks good in the dark and the light. You have to test them in both because you want to see what it's going to look like. But when I'm picking threads, what I'm doing is I'm going to pick 2 or 3 safe threads like tan or gray, and then I'm going to throw in a pop of another color, just a wild card, because you never know when it will work out. So when I'm thinking of threads, in this particular quilt, I'll put this back up here, if I loved this teal color, if this teal was like my favorite, I could have used like a light medium teal over the whole thing. Or maybe I loved the green, right? I could have pulled out some of those elements. So when somebody asks me what thread color to use, I usually ask them what their favorite color in the quilt is, and that usually gives you a guide. So let's see what that looks like in actuality. So here I have a sample. Now it's quilted. This is with Aurifil, so this is going to show up a little bit more. I want it to show up more because it's a class sample. I take this to my classes and stuff. But if you notice, even though it's teal and you can see it, it's not distracting, right? Sometimes you see dark thread on light fabric and you're like, that's just distracting. The reason this works, or the reason I think it works, is because it's the same value. They're both medium, right? So if it's the same value range, you can get away with using a lot of different threads. This is important to remember because if you ever pieced a quilt top with fabrics of the same value, you might have already seen this, right? Like, oh, I thought these two were so different. I put them next to each other, they disappear. The same value. So picking thread colors, here we can see an orange over the teal. Again, this is a class sample, so I wanted the quilting to show up a little bit more. But what's happening here is this is just a little darker than the background fabric. Okay, so I think it's good to have a set of rules or a routine that you follow. It just makes decision making so much easier. My rule of thumb is if I'm working on a quilt and picking out a thread, and I can't decide between two, or I'm not sure which one, I always opt for the lighter thread. I would rather have lighter thread on darker fabric than vice versa. Now this is the exception to the rule, right? Because this is a quilted sample for a class. This is not an actual quilt. So the difference between this and maybe something like this. So I have my gray fabric, it's real dark, but I went with a lighter color. So I like the look of this better than darker thread on a lighter fabric. That's just my opinion. I'm only the expert of my opinion. But I will say, I think it's because when you use a dark thread on lighter fabric, you lose the shadow or the texture of the quilting. And so all you see is the line, and it makes it pretty harsh and obvious where mistakes are. So a fun fact to note, when all this COVID stuff is over and you go to a quilt show and you have long arms on the floor demoing, I almost guarantee you they'll have dark fabric with lighter thread. No manufacturer is putting white fabric out there with dark thread because nothing looks good that way. All right, so sticking with the thread color, again, going with a pop of a different color. This is teal over the whole thing, just because it was for a book, but I think it's a great example of how color changes depending on the fabric that it's around. That's why it's important to lay the thread out actually on there. I've been in lectures and trunk shows where people have been like, there's no way, that's the same thread. And I'm like, it is, because it looks different depending on what it's around. So laying it out and kind of seeing it. And you can't just do something like this and set it on there because that's not what the thread is going to look like, right? The thread itself is going to look like this. And so I know you can't even see it, but I'm going to lay it out and just see the thread. So, but wait, there's more. I know, I just love talking about thread. I could do this all day. Okay, so here is another example of darker thread on lighter fabric, intentional. But if I absolutely have to use a thread that's darker on a lighter fabric, which sometimes happens, maybe most of the quilt is medium, but there's pops of, lighter colors. I know the quilting is going to show up a little bit more. I'm going to pick designs that don't have a lot of backtracking or thread buildup, because that's going to draw attention to it. So even though this is darker thread on a lighter fabric, they're still close in value. It's pretty close. And none of these designs have like backtracking. So it's going to help keep it not from distracting. So that means in a block, if there's a white center to the block and I'm using black thread, I'm going to do something geometric or basic in the white and then do all my crazy quilting somewhere else. So when I'm picking designs, it also has to do with how much is this going to show up and do I want it to show up that way. And another example of, oh, that has stuff on it, of picking a color in the same value. This is purple fabric, obviously, and I didn't have the exact purple, which that will happen, but finding something within that value range. So there's that orange thread again. This is Aurifil. Who knows? Maybe it was just the closest color that I could find. But since it's the same value, it's not too distracting. So this is definitely the case with like, whether it's dark, medium, or light. All right, one last quilted sample, and then I'm going to answer some questions. So this is a quilt from a book I did with Tula. I just want to show an example of one thread color over the whole quilt. So there's a lot of different colors going on here, but most of them are medium. There are some darks. There are some prints and some solids, but I went with that 403 kind of light tan color. A light yellow would have worked too. And then you can just see it looks different depending on the fabric that it's in. But in that really dark print, I kept the quilting more basic with just little like stars. And then in this corners, which you can't really see, but I knew you couldn't see the quilting anyway, so I just did some big swirls and some flowers and some fun stuff. So sometimes you might think, oh, I'm gonna have to change threads. There's, oh, so many shades of green. Try it out and see if you can't get away with using one thread over it. The reason this works is because it's 50 weight thread. Right? It's that thinner thread. It's gonna blend in and take on the color that it's around. Not necessarily the best time to use glide thread, right? When I have a bunch of different colors, unless I want the quilting to show up. Sometimes that is the case. All right, so some great questions. I'm going to keep my little monitor up here so that we can see what I'm talking about, and then I'll pull it to the big screen. So, let's see. So one thing I haven't talked about is, can you use different kinds of thread in the top and bottom? Yes, you can. You can mix weights, you can mix types, you can mix colors if you want. The trick is to have the tension set correctly. So if you're on a machine, a sewing machine, that you can adjust the tension on the bobbin, make sure the tension's set for that right, and then adjust it for the top. There's different reasons why you might want to do that. Maybe it's a contrasting color of fabric on the back and you don't want the quilting to show up very much, so you're using a thinner thread. Maybe you're gonna, it's a solid on the back and you want to see the quilting you're doing, so you use a little bit thicker thread. So there was a lot of questions about bobbins and thread color, so let's talk about that. One question that came up, it was really good. It was, I wrote it down here. Judy envies that people can use different thread colors in the top and bottom and not have any of those pokies show through. Well, if it works, right? So, but for the most part, I'm going to use the same color on top and bottom because it's almost impossible to keep perfect tension throughout the whole design, right? I mean, you're moving the quilt or the machine, you're going in points and slowing down. So I like to keep it similar in color so it helps hide some of those pokies. So the question though was also, well, what do I use in the bobbin? Vita asked, are pre-wounds easier to use than winding your own? Yes. Are they cost effective? Not necessarily. So what I like to use pre-wounds, and I think it's just because I've gotten lazy in my old age. Before I would have wound my own, but these are the bobbins I like to use. So what I have here, these are my long arm bobbins. These are the Magna Glide bobbins. So they are more expensive than winding your own. But one thing you have to remember is that they're wound much tighter so they can get more thread on there. That means less bobbin changes, and it's a consistent wind. This is what I use on my sewing machine, also from the company Hab & Dash that does glide. These are class 15 bobbins, so these just go in my sewing machine. Now, if I have all these bobbins though, it's hard to always have the right color to match, right? So there's that problem. Oh my gosh, if I'm gonna do yellow on top, and I don't have that yellow, I'm gonna find a bobbin color that's neutral in the value. So a medium gray or medium tan. I saw one question kind of pop up just briefly. If you're using monopoly on the top, what do you use on the bottom? Well, what I would use on the bottom is a bobbin thread that matches the quilt top. So if I'm using monopoly on top of a black quilt, I'm gonna do dark gray or black thread in the bobbin just to help hide those pokies. Again, only my opinion, only the expert of my opinion, so there is that. All right, other questions that came up the fabric that you're quilting can impact tension and give you some trouble. So one question came up like, why are batiks difficult to quilt? Why can't I use the same thread or the same tension? Well, it has to do with the weave of the fabric. If you think about the machine quilting process, this needle has to go through 2 layers of fabric, a layer of batting, catch the bobbin thread, and come back up in a split second. And anything that impedes that will cause problems. So a dull needle will give you trouble because it's slowing it down. A tightly wove fabric, like a batik, can give you trouble. So making sure you have a new needle, that you're quilting a little bit slower, that you don't have it stretched too tight if you're on a long arm will really help you out with that. Another question about thread came up was, can you use hand quilting thread on a sewing machine? And the short answer is no. I'm sure you probably could make it work if you had to, but the short answer is no. Most hand quilting thread is either waxed or has a finish or it's very thick. If you think about it, hand quilting thread has to be the only thing holding those layers together. That's all you got is that one thread. So a thicker thread is going to be appealing. On a sewing machine, you actually have 2 threads. And every time they make a stitch, they're actually making almost like a little knot. So it doesn't have to be quite as thick. If you had some hand quilting thread that wasn't super thick or not waxed or whatever, maybe you can make it work, but I don't think it would be worth the trouble of trying to figure it out. So for the most part, leave the hand quilting thread to hand quilting. On a different note, if let's say I go set up a machine or do some training and somebody has a lot of embroidery thread. Okay, so embroidery thread is gorgeous, right? It has that shine, the bright colors. It's usually rayon. And embroidery thread is usually a top stitching thread, so it doesn't have to handle as much of the stress as like machine quilting. I don't suggest using rayon thread, but if it works, it works. If you can get it to work, then you can definitely do that. But for the most part, I don't mess with it. Different question. This is good. Jackie O said, in the first episode of The Midnight Quilter, hope you watched it, I pressed the seams open. And it was like, well, she thought I pressed to the dark side, or what's going on? The world has lost its mind if I'm pressing seams open. Okay, let's be honest. When I'm piecing, sometimes I won't even press. It's because I'm quilting my own quilt and I know I can quilt it out. But with stars, or where you have all those points coming together in the center, pressing them open is going to kind of ease the bulk. Because what happens, right, if you have a bulky seam and you're trying to machine quilt over it, it's like running into a brick wall. So then you have to kind of work your way around it, and then you end up with like nipples all over your quilt. So I will press open if I have to. Doesn't mean that I'm becoming a perfectionist or anything like that. I just know it's going to be easier to help me out. Okay, so I'm going to kind of look through the questions real quick, and I'll tell you about the giveaway. What about poly embroidery thread? Sure, if it works, it works. That will be great. Stitching Sailor, thank you. Loving the stitching on the samples. So I will tell you this, that might be a giveaway sometime because I have tons of class samples that I don't use anymore, just little pieces like that. So it might be kind of fun to give that away. Jumbo bobbins are real nice. My Bernina has the special jumbo bobbins, no pre-wounds for me. That's super helpful. My handy quilter also has the bigger bobbins, and I still use pre-wounds. So it just depends on, what you're wanting to work with. Let's see. Usually my tension is about 4, and recently I've had to go like 7 in order for the top thread to pop up to the back. I don't understand why. I haven't changed the thread type. Well, something has probably changed, right? If something needs to be adjusted for a reason, right? Now, we might not know what it is. We have to find that out. Has the fabric changed? Has the needle become dull? Is there some kind of lint in somewhere that's impeding the process a little bit? Here's the thing about tension, and that's going to have to be its own chat, and really there's not a good answer. Anytime you have tension problems, the good news is it's probably just one little thing. The bad news is it can be like 100 little things. So kind of finding out what that thing is can be so frustrating. I joked one time that I'd like to do a flow chart, like a tension flow chart, right? Is your thread breaking? Yes or no? Is it da-da-da-da? But all the answers end with drink more wine. I think it'd be hilarious. We'll have to see if I can do that. But something has changed, and so now you just have to kind of really work through and find out what it is. Almost like a detective. I will say that when I'm talking to some of my owners or talking them through it, I'll say, okay, it was good and then it wasn't. What happened? Something changed. Nothing happened. Like, did you change your bobbin? Well, yeah, I did change my bobbin, and I accidentally dropped it on the floor, and the dog ran off with it. Okay, that could be why. Good question, Barb. You have a thread from a good company, but it doesn't specify the weight. Should I toss it or assume that it's 50 weight? It should say on it somewhere, even if it's not super obvious. So like Aurifil, it doesn't say 50 weight on here, but it does say 50/2, and I know that the 50, I think, means 50 weight. You can also contact the company and just give them any of the information, and they can tell you what it is. What I do love about Aurifil is you can tell by the color of the spool. So like their 40 weights are green, I think, or whatever. I just know that the orange is my happy place when it comes to the Aurifil thread. So this is perfect. This is what we'll end on. I'm a beginner at quilting. What would you suggest for my first time machine quilting? Items I may need or type of thread you should start with. So Crystal, what I would say is a 40 to 50 weight high quality thread, depending on the effect you want to go with. If you're like, no, you want a thread, tell me what to use, Angela, so I know what to do. I would say go with Aurifil. If you're piecing and quilting on your same sewing machine, it's just going to take some of those variables out of it, right? So, or Glide. I love Glide. That's what I use in all my challenges because I think it's a great machine quilting thread. I don't mind adjusting the tension between that and when I'm piecing. It gives me a little bit of a sheen. But beyond that, look for a color that blends into your quilt top. I think it's really important when you're starting out to have a blending thread because then you just see that nice overall texture and it gives you a little bit more confidence to keep going and you don't get so frustrated. Whatever you do, do not use a black thread on white fabric. Don't go that drastic, right? Keep the color the same. Okay, so one of the questions came up, just found me, am I doing this every Thursday? Yes, we've been doing this for I think almost 2 months. We won't be doing next Thursday though, so I won't be here. I will be probably miserable from eating too much food. But the next Thursday after that, December 3rd, I'll be back with another live chat and we'll have another giveaway. So every week or every time I chat, we have a giveaway. Last one was a quilt kit from the Variable Star, first episode of the Midnight Quilter. Oh my gosh, you guys, thank you for everyone that watched. So many views, such a good response, very heartening. Like I was just nervous about it, so I appreciate that. And Jennifer Jensen won the kit. So I'll be emailing you, Jennifer. Jennifer Jensen is the winner of the Variable Star quilt kit. Now, the next giveaway is for a fat quarter bundle, you ready for this, of my newest fabric collection. So I've designed a fabric collection, or I've designed fabric for like Build a Quilt. Our block of the month has 3 different colorways, and this is called Inked Rainbow. This is just a different collection, and what I love about it has a rainbow of colors, but these are all prints I designed inspired by calligraphy. So it says cute things like, when all else fails, just quilt. Quilters are materialistic, fun little things. And then cute little prints of shapes that I've drawn with my calligraphy pen. Definitely something I took up, a hobby I took up in the middle, or when we were shut down from the pandemic. So 20 different fat quarters. Somebody's going to win this beautiful bundle. And all you have to do is, after the video is over, the chat's over, just check out the description box. There is a link. Go to link, and that's how you can enter to win. And I will announce the winner on December 3rd. So 20 fat quarters of beautifulness. All right. Thank you for sticking around with me for almost an hour. I know it's a little bit longer than most chats, but man, I had a lot of stuff to talk about. If you have any questions, which I'm sure you do because that's all their thread just opens up a lot of questions, leave them in the comments below and I get on from time to time and answer them. And also other quilters like to chime in and help too. So we're definitely here to help out. And I hope you have a very great rest of your week, and I will see you on December 3rd for the next live chat. So until then, happy quilting.